Every spring, you go out there and put your tomato plants in the ground. You give them space. You set up a cage around each one. You water them. You wait. And by the end of summer, if everything goes right, maybe you pull 20, maybe 30 tomatoes off each plant. That is a solid harvest. Nothing to feel bad about, but nothing that stops you in your tracks either. Now here is the moment that completely flipped everything I thought I knew about growing tomatoes. About 10 years ago, I was over at my neighbor Jacob's place. He is an Amish farmer who has been working the same land his whole life, and he asked me to come help him tie up some of his tomato plants. I walked over to where he was working, and I looked around and realized we were standing in a patch of ground no bigger than your dining room table, maybe 10 square feet if that, and inside that tiny little patch, there were 4 tomato plants. Each one was climbing straight up a thick wooden pole going nearly 7 feet into the air. And every single one of those plants was loaded. I mean, absolutely covered with tomatoes from almost the bottom of the stem all the way up to the very top. I crouched down and started counting the tomatoes on just one plant. I got to 60 and stopped. And there were 4 plants in that same small space. I stood up and looked at Jacob and said, "Jacob, that is more tomatoes than I get from my entire row." He did not get excited. He just looked at me and said something real quiet and calm that I have been thinking about ever since. You stop letting the plant do whatever it wants. You give it one job and make sure it does that job. That one sentence right there changed everything about how I grow tomatoes. And today, I am going to walk you through exactly how the Amish squeeze massive harvests out of tiny spaces. We are going through 5 steps, and by the time we are done, you will see how the numbers work out to 150, even 200 tomatoes from a space most people walk right past without giving it a second look. And stay with me all the way to the end because I am going to share the exact planting hole mix that Jacob used for every single tomato transplant he ever put in the ground. It takes maybe 2 minutes to set up, and the difference in how fast your plants take off is something you can actually see within the first week. But before we get into step 1, let me tell you where I was before I learned any of this. I grew tomatoes the same way most backyard gardeners do. Row of plants, 3 to 4 feet between each one, wire cage around each one, let them grow. By midsummer, I had this big, tangled mess of green leaves going in every direction, fruit hiding somewhere inside the cage that I had to hunt for, and branches dragging on the ground with tomatoes just sitting there going soft. I was getting maybe 30 to 40 tomatoes per plant on a really good year, and I was using up a huge chunk of garden space to get that. Half the time, some of the fruit never even made it because it was on the ground rotting before I noticed it. I thought that was just the nature of tomatoes. That is just how they grow. It was not until I watched Jacob work his little 10 square foot patch that I realized I had been doing something really simple wrong the whole time. I was letting the plant go wherever it wanted instead of pointing it in one direction and letting it go hard in that direction. Let me show you how to fix that. And we start with the ground. Step 1 is building what I call an intensive bed. And this is where everything begins. When you are asking 4 to 6 plants to produce at this level inside 10 square feet, the soil cannot just be decent. It has to be outstanding. You are packing a lot of production into a very small space, and the roots have to have everything they need right there within reach. Here is how to set it up. Pick a patch that is roughly 2.5 feet wide by 4 feet long. That gives you about 10 square feet. If you have raised beds, this fits perfectly. If you are growing in the ground, just mark off that area and put all your effort there. In the fall before you plant, or at the very least 4 to 6 weeks before your last expected frost work, 3 to 4 inches of finished compost into that bed. Do not just sprinkle it on top. Mix it down deep into the top 8 to 10 inches of soil. Once you have done that, add a 1-inch layer of well-aged manure right on top of that compost layer. Horse or cow manure that has been sitting and breaking down for at least 6 months is what you want. This gives the soil a slow-release nitrogen source and brings in a whole new wave of biological activity that feeds your plants all season long. If you can get your hands on leaf mold, that is just old decomposed leaves, add about 1 inch of that too. Leaf mold does something really special for roots. It holds moisture like a sponge, and it brings in the fungal side of soil life that helps roots pull nutrients in much more efficiently. If you do not have leaf mold, do not stress about it. The compost and the aged manure will do most of the work on their own. The whole point here is to build a root zone so rich that your plants never hit a wall in July and August when they are working the hardest. Jacob's beds had been built up over decades of the same treatment, but even then, he added fresh compost and manure every single fall. He said even the best ground needs to be fed if you are going to keep asking it to work. If you have heavy clay soil, the compost and organic matter will start opening it up within 1 season. If you have sandy soil, the organic matter will help it hold water and nutrients instead of letting them drain right through. Either way, that bed will feel different in your hands within a few months. And once the soil is right, what you build above it matters just as much. Step 2 is going vertical. And this is where the Amish approach really separates itself from how most of us grow tomatoes. Forget the wire cages. I know they are easy and they have been around forever, but cages are built for plants that bush out and spread in every direction. And spreading in every direction is exactly what we are trying to stop. What you want instead is a simple, tall, solid staking system that trains your plants to grow straight up like a column, not outward like a bush. Here is what to do. Get yourself either wooden stakes or heavy metal posts. They need to stand 7 to 8 feet above the soil line, which means you want something 8 to 9 feet total, since you are going to drive about a foot of it into the ground for stability. Whatever you use, it has to be solid. No flexing, no wobbling. These plants are going to be carrying a serious amount of fruit by midsummer, and a weak stake will bend or fall over right when you need it most. Space your stakes 18 to 24 inches apart inside your 10 square foot bed in a 2.5 foot by 4 foot bed that gives you room for 4 to 6 plants depending on how tight you go. I have found that 4 plants at 24-inch spacing is the sweet spot for airflow and production. But if you are in a longer season area like zones 7 through 9, you can push it to 5 or even 6 plants at 18-inch spacing because you have more growing time before frost comes. As each plant grows, tie it to the stake every 8 to 10 inches using soft strips of cloth or old t-shirt material or garden twine. Do not use wire or anything stiff that can cut into the stem. The tie should be firm enough to hold the plant up but loose enough that the stem can still thicken and grow naturally. You are training each plant to grow as one tall single column of production, not a bush. All the energy goes straight up. All the fruit forms along that one central line and nothing ever touches the ground. There is another method that works really well in a small space, and it is called the Florida weave. Jacob used this in his market beds. You put stakes at each end and between every 2 plants. Then you run a line of heavy garden twine along both sides of the row at 8-inch intervals as the plants grow. The twine basically sandwiches the plants between 2 lines and holds them up without you having to tie each one individually. It is faster to set up and works especially well when you have 4 or more plants growing in a line. Either method works. Your plants grow straight up. The fruit is easy to reach and off the ground. Air moves freely around the leaves, which keeps disease down, and you are using vertical space instead of spreading sideways. Jacob's plants hit 7 feet by midsummer, and they were still setting new fruit at the very top when the first frost finally came in the fall. Standing in that little patch next to them honestly felt like standing inside a green wall that was just dripping with tomatoes. Now, growing straight up is only half of what makes this work. The other half is what you take off the plant. And this is the part that felt completely backwards to me the first time I saw it happen. That brings us to step 3. Step 3 is pruning. And I will be honest with you, this is the step that most people fight against the hardest. It was the hardest one for me to get comfortable with too. The first time I watched Jacob prune his tomatoes, I genuinely thought he was making a mistake. He walked along the row with a sharp pair of hand shears, and he was cutting off what looked like half the plant. Side shoots, lower branches, leaves below the first cluster of fruit, all of it was coming off. He stripped those full, lush green plants down to one main stem with a handful of branches and fruit clusters, and everything in me wanted to say something, but I kept my mouth shut because I had already seen what his plants produced, and his harvest was 3 times what I was getting. Here is what he was doing and why it actually works. Indeterminate tomato plants, which are the type Jacob grows for this method, have a natural habit of throwing out what are called suckers. A sucker is a new little shoot that sprouts right in the V-shaped joint where a side branch meets the main stem. If you leave that sucker alone, it grows into a whole new stem with its own branches and its own fruit. That sounds like a great thing. More stems, more tomatoes, right? Not quite. Every sucker you leave on the plant pulls energy away from the main stem. The plant spreads itself thin, trying to keep all those extra branches going. The fruit gets smaller. There is technically more of it, but a lot of it never fully ripens before frost gets it. And all that extra leafy growth creates a thick, dense canopy where moisture gets trapped, airflow dies off, and fungal problems like early blight move right in and take over. What Jacob did was prune each plant down to either 1 or 2 main leaders. 1 leader means you remove every single sucker, and the plant puts every bit of its energy into one vertical stem. 2 leaders means you let one strong sucker near the base grow into a second stem, and you cut everything else off. Either way, you are focusing the plant like a laser beam. Instead of making 100 small tomatoes that ripen slowly and get lost in a jungle of leaves, the plant makes 40 to 60 full-sized, fully ripe tomatoes right along that one clean vertical stem that you can see and reach without any trouble. Here is exactly how to do it. Once your plant is about 12 to 18 inches tall, start checking the leaf joints every single week. That is where a side branch connects to the main stem. When you see a sucker starting to grow there and it will look like a tiny little stem with small leaves poking out of the joint, pinch it off with your fingers while it is still 2 to 3 inches long. At that size, it just snaps off clean and the spot heals up fast. If a sucker gets bigger than about 4 inches, use clean shears to cut it instead of tearing it. Tearing a large sucker can damage the main stem, and that is a door you do not want to open for disease. Also, take off all the leaves and branches below the lowest cluster of fruit on the plant. Those lower leaves are not doing much for photosynthesis by the time midsummer rolls around, but they are sitting right next to the soil where blight spores splash up every time it rains. Removing them gives the base of the plant much better airflow and cuts way down on disease pressure. I walk through my tomatoes every week, usually in the morning. I prune each plant, and it takes maybe 2 minutes. It still feels a little aggressive sometimes, especially when you are holding a perfectly healthy-looking branch that you just cut off. But a couple of weeks after you start doing it, you will see the difference clearly. The fruit that stays on the plant gets noticeably bigger, it ripens faster, and the whole plant looks open and clean and healthy instead of overgrown and crowded. Jacob used to say that pruning is not about removing things. It is about telling the plant exactly where to send its strength. That is a principle the Amish seem to apply to a lot more than just gardening. And it works every single time. Now, what I have shared so far is a real part of this system, but it is still just part of the picture. If you want the full plan laid out step by step so you know exactly what to do, and when I want you to check out the guide I put together, it is called the 30-Day Amish Garden System, and it is everything I have picked up from living next to Amish farmers for the last 3 decades, organized into a simple plan you can start using this season. It covers the complete 5-layer approach to building a garden that basically takes care of itself. It has the full 4-bed crop rotation system that stops disease and pests before they ever get a foothold. And it includes a companion planting guide so you know exactly what grows well together and why. You can find the link right down below this video in the description. Or if you are watching on your TV or computer, grab your phone, open the camera, and point it at the QR code showing on screen right now. It will take you straight there. No searching, no typing needed. All right, let us keep going. Step 4 is choosing the right varieties. And this one matters a lot more than most people give it credit for. Not every tomato plant is set up to work with this system. You need indeterminate varieties. That means plants that keep on growing and keep on setting fruit continuously all the way through the season until frost finally shuts them down. Determinate varieties grow to a set height, produce all their fruit in a short window, and then they are finished. Determinates have their place in the garden, but for this intensive vertical approach, you want the kind of plant that never stops. Here are the varieties Jacob grew and the ones I have had the best results with myself. Brandywine is an old heirloom indeterminate that puts out large, meaty, incredibly good-tasting fruit. It is not the biggest producer by numbers, but the quality of each tomato is outstanding and they are substantial in size. Cherokee Purple is another heirloom that grows really well in a vertical system. It has rich, deep flavor and better disease resistance than most heirlooms, which is a nice bonus. San Marzano is a paste-type indeterminate that sets heavy clusters of long fruit. If you are measuring total tomatoes per plant, San Marzano is hard to beat because of how freely it sets fruit throughout the season. Rutgers is an older variety that the Amish in my area have grown for generations. It is reliable, consistent, productive, and handles summer heat without much trouble. For people in shorter season zones like 4 and 5, look at Early Girl or Stupus. Both are indeterminate varieties that start producing earlier in the season and give you more time before frost comes calling. The main thing is to plant varieties you already know do well in your specific area and resist the urge to grow too many different types in a small space. In a 10 square foot bed with 4 plants, I usually go with 2 of my best main season variety and 2 heavy producers like San Marzano. That mix of quality and quantity adds up faster than you expect. Step 5 is the one that takes you from a good harvest to a harvest that surprises people who walk through your garden. It is called succession planting. Most of us put all our tomato plants in the ground on the same day in late spring, and then we just wait. The problem with that is all those plants reach their peak at roughly the same time. You get this flood of tomatoes for a few weeks in August, and then things slow down as the plants get older and worn out. The Amish stagger their plantings instead of doing it all at once. Jacob did not put every tomato in the ground on the same day. He planted his first wave about 2 weeks after his last expected frost date. Then 2 to 3 weeks after that, he put in a second wave. And sometimes 2 to 3 weeks after that, a third wave went in. Each wave was either started from seed indoors ahead of time, or he sourced them as transplants that were ready to go in the ground at just the right moment. What this does is create overlapping windows of production. Your first wave is going heavy in July and early August. Your second wave hits its stride in August and September. If you have a third wave, it carries you right up to the first frost of fall. In zones 7 through 9, where the growing season is long, 3 waves is very doable. In zones 5 and 6, 2 waves is more realistic. In zone 4, you can still pull off 2 waves if you start your second round of seeds indoors early and use row covers to protect them and stretch the season a bit. Here is where the numbers come together. One well-pruned indeterminate tomato plant growing on a vertical stake in deeply enriched soil can produce 40 to 60 tomatoes over a full season. 4 plants in your 10 square foot bed gives you 160 to 240 tomatoes in a single wave. If you add even a second wave, either by replacing your first plants when they start slowing down or by setting up a second small bed nearby, you extend that production across the entire season. Jacob handled it slightly differently. He kept those same 4 plants going in that small patch all season long and managed them so carefully and consistently that they never really slowed down the way mine used to. His weekly pruning, his steady watering schedule, and that extraordinary soil he had built up over years kept the plants at their peak far longer than anything I grew before I learned this system. My best year using this approach was about 180 tomatoes out of a 10 square foot bed. Jacob consistently hit 200. The difference between us was his decades of soil building and his absolute discipline with the weekly pruning routine. I am still working on catching up to him, honestly. Now let me go over some patterns I used to see in my own conventional tomato growing and how the Amish way handles each one differently. The first one is using wire cages and letting plants bush out in every direction. Cages are easy, but they encourage exactly the kind of sprawling growth that limits how much a plant actually produces. Energy gets divided across dozens of stems. Fruit ends up shaded or small, or sitting on the ground where it goes soft. The Amish vertical stake system concentrates all that energy straight up and keeps every single tomato off the ground and in full light. The second pattern is never removing suckers. Most home gardeners let every sucker grow because more green growth looks like more production. What you actually end up with is more leaves, more disease pressure, and smaller tomatoes that take longer to ripen. The Amish prune aggressively because they understand that a few strong focused stems produce far more usable fruit than a dozen weak ones fighting over the same plant energy. The third pattern is planting everything on the same day. One planting date gives you one harvest window with a peak and then a decline. Staggering your planting dates spreads that window across multiple months, so you are never overwhelmed all at once and never going through a long dry stretch without tomatoes coming in. The fourth pattern is spacing plants too far apart out of habit. The old conventional wisdom of 3 to 4 feet between plants makes total sense when you are growing big, sprawling bushes. But when you are growing vertically and pruning each plant down to 1 liter 18 to 24 inches is all you need. You are working with the vertical space above each plant, not the horizontal space around it. None of these old habits will completely destroy your garden. They just leave a lot of production sitting on the table that you never get to enjoy. Adding the Amish approach of vertical staking, focused pruning, and staggered planting to what you already know how to do can honestly double or even triple what you pull out of the same amount of ground. Now here is the planting hole recipe I promised you at the very start of this video. This is something Jacob did for every single tomato transplant he ever put in the ground without exception. And it is so simple that the first time he walked me through it, I almost did not believe it would actually make a difference. Before you set your transplant, dig your hole about twice as wide and twice as deep as the root ball of the plant you are putting in. Into the bottom of that hole, add 2 generous handfuls of finished compost, 1 teaspoon of bone meal, and 1 tablespoon of crushed dried eggshells. Save your eggshells over the winter, dry them out, and crush them up. Mix all 3 of those things into the soil at the bottom of the hole with your fingers. Then set your transplant in deep. Bury the stem all the way up to the lowest set of leaves. Tomatoes will grow new roots right along any part of the stem that gets buried underground, so planting deep gives you a much bigger root system right from day one. Fill in around the plant using a mix of your native soil and a little more compost. Water it in well. Then lay down 3 to 4 inches of straw mulch around the base of the plant, leaving a small 2-inch gap right around the stem itself so it can breathe. The bone meal breaks down slowly and feeds the roots with phosphorus, which drives both root development and fruit production. The crushed eggshells add calcium to the soil, right where the roots are going to find it first, and calcium is what prevents blossom end rot, which is one of the most frustrating problems tomato growers deal with. And the extra compost gives those roots immediate access to rich living soil material right at the very moment they need it most. I have been using this planting hole recipe for about 8 years now. The difference in how fast newly planted tomatoes establish themselves is visible within the first week. Plants that get this treatment put down, roots faster, start growing faster, and they hit their first fruit clusters earlier than plants that go into a plain hole with nothing added. Jacob never planted a tomato any other way. He said you only get one chance to give a plant a good start. You might as well make it count. And that is really the whole philosophy behind everything we covered today. You are not just growing tomatoes, you are building a system. Rich soil that never runs out, vertical growth that uses space the way the Amish use space. Pruning that focuses the plant on doing one job and doing that job well. The right varieties that keep producing instead of quitting early. And staggered planting that keeps tomatoes coming in from early summer right through to fall. 5 steps, 10 square feet, 150 to 200 tomatoes. Jacob showed me all of this standing in a patch of dirt smaller than most people's coffee tables. And once you see it working in your own garden, you will never go back to the old way. Give it a try this season. Start with the planting hole recipe alone if that is all you do differently this year. Then add the vertical stakes. Then start pruning. Each piece you add will show you results you can see and count. And if you want the complete plan, all of it laid out in order, go check out that guide in the description below. Everything in one place ready to go for this season. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next one.